Following the profitable release of the Technomancer in 2016, Spiders, the developers, not our disgusting eight-legged enemies, wanted to go bigger. Looking to fill the void left by BioWare, and with the backing of their publishers Focus Home Interactive, they set to work on Greedfall. After 3 years and €5 million, it was released on the 10th of September 2019. While the budget and manpower isn't exactly AAA, it was a huge risk considering their biggest budget up until this point was €600,000. I totally bought into this story, a small developer looking to grow, taking a risk to produce something special. What they ended up with was, well, let's talk about it. The game opens on Desade's official portrait, which doubles as a character creation menu, and from the very first frames I feel like praising this game because I'm a boring loner with nothing better to do. Rather than having the bog standard RPG appearance menu before the game opens, the developers have thought about how to tie a screen that players will spend about 2 minutes looking at into the setting and gives the player important exposition. It's clear that Desade is an important person because, well, they don't let everybody have their portrait done and not everybody gets called Excellency. The customization itself is pretty limited, but it does the job. The player is then introduced to character progression. Character progression is divided into 3 areas: skills, attributes and talents. Skills basically equate to your moveset during combat by allocating points into the skill tree and both improve the moves you already have or acquire new ones. There is an insane amount of variety and choice here for acquiring new moves, and I think this serves the game really well. As the character gets stronger, the player is given more options. This results in a player having the tangible sense of their progression while constantly changing the dynamic of the combat system. One of the biggest problems I have with character progression in RPGs is when they decide to show your character's growth by simply having the numbers get higher. It's boring, repetitive, and provides no variety whatsoever, which is quite important if you want to keep players interested for 40 odd hours. In attributes, the numbers get higher. Attributes determine the quality of weapon you can use with things like base health and health regeneration. This is so boring that I don't want to talk about it anymore. Talents are very similar in the sense that the numbers just get higher. Woo, so fun and interesting. But there is one key difference. Talents potentially define how the player may approach almost every single quest in the game. Player agency, or the control given to a player, is vital to an RPG. The best RPGs will give players control over their characters, not just in terms of appearance and fighting style, but also in terms of morality, with a great sense of freedom as the player's decisions impact the story and the world around them, as well as letting the player approach quests in a number of ways, all resulting in a unique experience for everybody who plays them. Greedfall attempts to do all this, and fails. The player has a choice of 6 talents, and these provide you with different gameplay opportunities based on standard skill checks. This would normally provide players with a great sense of control, but these talents are rendered useless by the lack of agency the player has over the story. Greedfall is trying to tell a specific story, so you have to achieve each quest's specific outcome, meaning that if you don't have the required talent level to do something, it doesn't matter. The quest might be a bit harder and take longer, but that's it. There's no consequences here. This problem is prevalent throughout the game as the player has no control over the story, and I mean literally none until right at the end. But we'll get to that later. This singular storytelling means the player has no control over their character's motivations and morality, reducing the sense of control further. This results in the game feeling like less of an RPG and more of an interactive story. This isn't helped by the fact you don't actively feel a part of the world. There is nothing to do other than the quests. And environmental storytelling is few and far between. You don't feel like your actions have any effect on the world, as archaic as it may look. Sweeping landscapes and grand structures give a good sense of awe and scale, but character models are dated with limited facial animation and unconvincing lip sync. NPCs will often repeat the same gestures until the conversation ends, while the same vague mumble animation is used for the large volumes of dialogue the developers couldn't sync. It's testament to the voice actors and the writers then that the story doesn't feel diminished and they can bring these characters to life, even if they don't do much. After 45 hours spent on Tier 3D, having met a plethora of characters and a number of factions, you'd think I'd be able to remember a couple of them. But I can't. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm sorry if this gets boring. But it's not your video, so accept the grind. 3 nations from the continent, the Congregation of Merchants, the Bridge Alliance and Teleme, are colonising Tier 3D. Each contracted the Nauts to sail them there and the Coin Guard to serve as protection on the island. This premise has amazing potential, and it got me excited. I can't really tell you why, but it's probably because I'm a boring loner with nothing better to do. And it was incredibly disappointing to see that these factions only really have one characteristic. The Congregation of Merchants, that's the player's faction, are neutral. How interesting. The Coin Guard are mercenaries motivated by money. The Nauts have institutionalised sailing so that only they can do it, and sometimes they buy children. The Bridge Alliance and Teleme might as well be the same faction. The Bridge Alliance are religiously devoted to science, while Teleme are religiously devoted to a religion. This devotion leads both factions to become increasingly hostile and pretty racist towards the natives. The natives have a strange magical connection to the island that only they understand. This mystery is well explored and fleshed out. You spend most of the game interacting with and trying to win over the native tribes. I couldn't tell you any of their names though, because you spend about 2 minutes with each of the 7 million tribes they're divided up into. The companions are no better, they have great moments but nothing substantial. Vasco, for example, asks you to help him find the family that sold him to the Nauts. He realises over the course of his questline that the Nauts are his family and he wouldn't want to be anywhere else. In theory, this is an incredibly interesting arc, but in reality there was so little focus on character work, instead narrowing in on reading paperwork and killing bandits, that I couldn't care less. This happened with all the companions, and the only reason I finished the quest lines was because doing so gives the player a talents boost. The idea that a superficial gameplay boost is relied on to keep a player interested in side quests is a damning one for a story-driven RPG. And this is such a shame. There is such ambition here. Throughout the entire playthrough there isn't a single fetch quest, an annoying staple of RPGs. This is where the game really threatens to be great. The right intentions were there, it just fails to stick the landing. And I understand at this point the video has been quite negative, and that's not really how I want this to come across. So let's talk about some things that the game does really well. From the moment you arrive on Tier 3D, you can go anywhere, even though you might not realise it looking at the map, but you can. This, like all open worlds, poses an interesting question to the devs. How do you give the players a good sense of progression while keeping the right level of challenge? Most developers opt to procedurally generate enemies depending on the player's level, hopefully meaning that nothing is too difficult or too easy for the player. However, this also means that the player gets exactly the same experience throughout the entire game. Thankfully, Greedfall doesn't do this. Instead, you can run into areas, monsters and bandits that are far too strong for you from the get-go. In fact, to get to some early quests you are forced to go through those areas. It might seem harsh, but I think it's really good game design. It fits the narrative that the island is hostile to the colonials. And when the player is tasked with helping caravans deal with bandit and creature attacks causing resources to dwindle, you empathise with these people because you've been killed by the bandits and creatures time and time again. It also gives the player a tangible sense of getting stronger as you return to these areas and blitz through enemies. This sense of progress in particular helps an already solid combat system stay engaging for a full playthrough. The tactical combat system starts off shallow with a pretty standard set of moves, but as the horizontal progression of the game's skill tree kicks into gear, then there's a surprising amount of options and depth here. The amount of moves and skills you can add keep the combat dynamic fresh and flexible. This and the decent range of enemies, each having their own unique strengths and weaknesses, results in a pretty enjoyable combat system. The player having total freedom to mould their Desade into any type of fighter they want is possibly the only area where the player is given full ownership of their character other than appearance. Another thing the game does well is crafting. It's pretty standard and boring to talk about, so moving on. I've tried to avoid spoilers as much as possible so far because even though this game is flawed, I still wouldn't try and stop people from playing it. So skip to the timecode if you don't want the end ruined. The driving force behind the plot is a search to cure the Malachor, a disease tearing through your people. Your investigation leads you to believe that a demon called the Enel Frictamen cursed your people for previous attempts at colonising the island. While this is happening, your cousin Constantine becomes infected and his health begins to deteriorate. You contact the best healer on the island, a native called Katasak, to ease his pain. And in a race against time, you try and meet with the Enel Frictamen. To do so, you need the approval of the native's High King Vimbar, but he's been missing for months. When you return to tell Constantine of your findings, it turns out he's missing, so the game turns into an exceptional Maddie simulator as you attempt to find him. It turns out that Katasak had taken him to perform a ritual to turn him into a Denegad, a class of native resistant to the disease. But you discover that Vimbar the High King had attacked them and taken Constantine. So you slap him up and free Constantine, rig an election so that the natives' new leader lets you meet Enel Milfrictaman, who turns out to be one thick tree. It tells you that Constantine is draining his power using the Denegad ritual Katasak taught him, and the Malachor is a result of the colonial treatment of Tier 4D's environment. I don't have a problem with any of that. Obviously the quality of a story is completely subjective, but for me there was a strong sense of mystery that held my interest throughout the second half of the playthrough. But unfortunately this fell apart at the end. In an incredibly strange decision, the player is given a choice of endings. During the final confrontation with Constantine, the player can either join him and become a godlike figure seizing dual control over the island in a reign of terror, or kill him. This feels completely out of place in a story where Desade has been so strongly characterised as a moral and kind character, to the point where almost every quest starts with people asking them for help to stop injustices. Not to mention the fact that Desade had just united every faction in the game with the sole intention of stopping him. So the choice between a clear good and bad ending is totally uninteresting, as almost all players will choose to kill Constantine because it fits with the characterisation the game has drilled in for 45 hours. And if all players are making the same choice, then what's the point in giving them the option? The decision to give players a choice between two endings might work if they presented the players with a choice where there was no definitively good one. And I feel like that's what they were aiming for, because otherwise why is it here? Why not to give one ending fitting of the story you wanted to tell? But the fact that the player spends barely any time with Constantine means that you don't care about him, no matter how many times NPCs tell you about how much you love him. And as we don't actually experience any of this, the ending falls flat, which is such a shame given the quality of the voice acting and writing throughout deserved a better payoff. A short playthrough of Greedfall is 30 hours, yet this video will end up at around 15 minutes. Not by design. When I started working on this video I expected it to be far longer, but as I kept cutting sections from the script it became clear that there just wasn't that much to talk about. There is good stuff in there, a lot of bad as well, but most of it isn't worthy of note. Despite this, by November of last year it surpassed 1 million sales. An unqualified success that has earned Spiders a new partnership with Nacon, the publishers behind those Sherlock games, and I couldn't be happier. Even though the game fell short of its lofty ambitions by quite some way, it's a solid experience. An achievement which shouldn't be underestimated with the limited budget, manpower and inexperience of the developers. So where do they go from here? Well, obviously, the French Revolution with robots.